Broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello everyone and welcome to another WilmsFront featured interview show on this Sunday, the 25th of February 2024. We are broadcasting live on the WilmsFront YouTube channel, the WilmsFront Odyssey channel, and the WilmsFront Rumble channel. It is 9 p.m. here in Melbourne, Victoria, which, as most of you in the audience will be aware, sadly has become the home of anti-Australian activism and the demonisation of Australian history and the people who built it, as evidenced by the tearing down of those Captain Cook monuments before Australia Day, which the culprits are still at large. Now, because Australia was built by white European people, namely the first settlers, the Anglo-Celtic from the British Isles, it's not just Australia, every nation that has a white European majority, regardless of whether it's a white population that is an indigenous or settlers, is under attack from anti-whites who aim to erase the historical achievements of those white majority nations. I mean, just look at Google Gemini, what it's put out lately. They also, these anti-whites, discriminate against white people, attack white culture and traditions, and eventually want to force whites to be a minority by supporting mass migration, making multiculturalism compulsory, and outlawing all dissent. One organisation here which is fighting back is the British Australian community, whose purpose is to represent the interests of and to promote the culture of Anglo Australians. My guest tonight is the past president of the British Australian community, Dr. Frank Salter, who is a human behavioural biologist. His most seminal work on the matter is the book on genetic interests, family, ethnicity, humanity in the age of mass migration. His most recent book is Anglophobia, the Unrecognised Hatred, co-authored with Harry Richardson. Frank, welcome to WilmsFront.
Great to be here.
And you're a guest who is by popular demand. So we've all my regulars are here eager, and a few of your other followers from the British Australian community. Now, my first question is, the most commonly used phrase to describe modern vilification and discrimination against whites is anti-whiteism. That's the term that I use on my show. It's mainly used by a lot of the United States-based white YouTubers. Why has British Australian community decided to use instead the term Anglophobia?
Tim, we agonised over this because anti-whiteism, that's a fine term. Anti-white, races against white people, those are all accurate. But we're dealing with a more particular population. We're ethnically oriented. And of course, all ethnic groups have racial identity as well. I'm aware of that. But the term white is quite broad. It means all people derived from European populations, and Anglo countries are, yes, they are that, but they're more particular. They're of Anglo-Celtic origin, which is derived from the native peoples of the British Isles. So we struggled over it because the term you're suggesting is accurate. But we find the additional term of Anglophobia, or anti-Anglo hatred, one could call it, particularly appropriate for Australia and Canada and New Zealand and the British Isles, because it applies to them. Now, there's a pragmatic reason for this too. People are not as motivated by race as they are by tribe. we are evolved with a psychology that links in with tribal concerns, threats to the tribe. Now, what is a tribe? Well, a tribe is an ethnic group. One could translate it that way. So ethnicity is much closer to our evolved psychology, and therefore we think we're likely to have more success in mobilizing people, in getting them concerned about threats to their ethnic families, using the rhetoric, the terminology of tribe rather than race. Race is a very large category, still valid, theoretically valid, but less motivating, we think.
Because obviously Europe, it's made up of different white tribes, or another term that's used is ethnic group. There's obviously the northern Germanic in Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, and then over in Eastern Europe, there's the Slavic populations, to just name a few off the top of my head. But is the reason you chose Anglophobia is because, well, your organization's called the British Australian Community, and the organization is representing who were the original settlers. Now, obviously, in the 19th century, there was a whole bunch of migrants coming from the mainland continent. I mean, my surname Wilms is German. The first Wilms came to Australia in the 19th century.
Yeah. No, it's again valid points. If you have a look at our writings and our videos, we talk about Anglophobia, hatred of British tribe peoples, but we also talk about anti-white rhetoric, anti-white defamation. So both are valid. It depends the scale that one is focusing on. The reality in the United States, I understand why they prefer the term whites, right? It's because they've had such large non-British immigration over so many years. The Germans began arriving in the United States in the 1700s, and then came the Irish in the 1840s, and went on from there. So, but in Australia, and I think Anglos make up around 25% of the American population. Germans are the single largest ethnic group in America, mainly because a lot of Anglos just think of themselves as just American. But Australia and New Zealand and Canada are different, or have been different. We've been predominantly Anglo-Celtic, predominantly British in our fairly recent origins. So we thought that was appropriate, even though we're aware of non-British immigration as well from the 19th century on.
Now, do you believe that mass migration to majority white countries is primarily an anti-white policy, or is mass migration just a culmination of the ease of mass travel in these modern times? Because for centuries and millennia, humanity didn't have any means to travel other than just by foot.
Yes, on both points. Both points are correct. I see them as both as necessary conditions for the replacement level migration we're seeing around especially the Anglo world, but also with some European countries. Yes, that second reason you gave is true. We have tremendous technologies now, industrial scale technologies for moving masses of people. That's one point. Second point, we have built society so attractive, like heaven on earth almost, compared to many hellholes around the world, that many people want to come to the West. Welfare, safe streets, schools where the children go and are safe, relatively uncorrupted officials and police. This is a wonderful thing in much of the world, where corruption is the norm. And of course we have corruption too, but the level is much lower. So there's a tremendous pull factor, a tremendous market force. People want to come to our countries. And that, which brings me to your first point, which is it due to anti-white activity? Well, indirectly and powerfully it is, because they dismantle our barriers. They dismantle our immigration selection procedures by which we maintained our identity over 200 years. So soon after, by the late 19th century, Australia was a wonderful place to come. People, and it wasn't just people rushing to mine gold, pan gold, and it wasn't just, for the jobs. It was also for that way of life, that tremendous freedom, and access to the Western world. So there's a Western global economic network that moving to Australia or Canada or New Zealand or Britain or America gets you into. So your family is then able to move between those countries with relatively little friction. So that is the way in which the politics of migration has become a matter of life and death, actually, for the Australian nation. Maybe not so much life and death for individuals, because so far we haven't entered the stage of mass violence, luckily in this country. Hopefully that will never come. But survival of national identity is now under threat.
As I mentioned before, obviously the Anglo-Celtic British were the original settlers, and then a lot of mainland European people migrated here. But the policy up until you'd say the 70s and 80s, and it's very clear why this policy changed during that time. So originally the immigration policy was assimilation. Obviously, I mentioned my family, my ancestors came from Germany, but I speak fluent English with an Australian accent. I'm fully assimilated. Australia is the country that I grew up in and love being here. But now we have multiculturalism, and some people say coincidentally or not coincidentally came in when the White Australia policy was dismantled, and immigrants came in from Asia, the subcontinent, the Middle East over the last 50 years up until the present day. So now we have multiculturalism, which it's promoted by both major parties and is also legislated in law. I remember when I attended Blair Cottrell's appeal against his racial and religious tolerance conviction for that mock beheading at the Bendigo, outside the Bendigo Council. What I learned from sitting in that courtroom was that the reason for this act is because we need to enshrine multicultural harmony in law.
Yes, well, they'd need to, wouldn't they? Because it certainly won't come from the multicultural society. Multiculturalism is not just correlated in time with a liberal immigration policy or an open doors or non-discriminatory immigration policy. It's part and parcel of the two. I'm interested. I've taken interest recently in a speech given by Prime Minister Bob Hawke, 26th of January, 1988. So it's the second bicentennial. So it's the bicentennial of the First Fleet coming, and he was speaking at Sydney Harbour to a large audience. The tall ships were coming in through the heads. And he gave a very important speech that I suspect he's predecessor, Malcolm Fraser, didn't have the wit to give, but Hawke was something of a scholar. Hawke was a Rhodes Scholar, in fact, Oxford University graduate, and able to put ideas together in a coherent manner. And he explained what multiculturalism meant in concrete terms, and it's so shocking to read that speech. The ABC refers to it as the no ethnic hierarchies speech. And in that speech, Hawke said, in Australia, what does it mean to be an Australian? What does it mean? What is Australian identity? And he disparaged the old British idea that we are an outpost of Britain and Europe, that original idea. He said, no, we are anyone who loves Australia is an Australian. The man was a revolutionary. That's an extraordinary thing to say. Anyone who loves Australia is an Australian. So someone watching his TV in Outer Mongolia or in Congo, for example, who watches The Flying Doctor and falls in love with the Australian way of life or the Australian scenery or whatever, is an Australian. Hawke went on. And he explained that Australian national identity was coming more and more to be constituted by diversity. So diversity was Australia. So Australia, in other words, Australia no longer had any particular national identity, like from one or a cluster of ethnic groups. No, it was diversity itself. This is doctrinaire, radical, political multiculturalism. Okay, so it was extremely dangerous, and I was almost 30 years old at the time. I don't remember him giving the speech. It had no impact on me. I think I needed someone to, theoretically sound to watch the speech and give a commentary on it. But that didn't happen. It sort of went under the radar. And to my horror, about a month ago, ex-Prime Minister John Howard was being interviewed, and he referred to Hawke's 1988 speech, and he said, "Oh, yes, that's all true. That's all true," and then moved on and discussed something else. So one of our most famous conservative prime ministers, and long-serving one, and one responsible for massive replacement level non-white immigration, John Howard, agrees with this Bolshevik notion. Now, if one steps back and views this extraordinary radical position from a historical perspective, what Hawke was signifying was this: that the Commonwealth of Australia, the state apparatus, has switched its loyalty from the people who created it, namely Anglo Australia, and all those who've assimilated into it. For short, I call it Anglo-Celtic Australia. The Commonwealth is no longer loyal to that. It's loyal to minorities. Because he said, in effect, there is no ethnic hierarchy in Australia. Anyone who loves Australia is Australian. Someone who arrived yesterday on a boat or a jumbo jet and got his citizenship papers was just as good, just as much an Australian as someone whose family had been here for 5 or 6 or 7 generations. Now, that's simply a lie. I say lie, deliberate untruth, because Hawke was too clever not to know that it was a lie. Malcolm Fraser maybe believed it, but Hawke knew what he was doing. Which takes me, and I'll finish this long rant, which takes me to the work of David Brown, political scientist who wrote a book in the year 2000 on this subject. And he was discussing what multiculturalism actually means in political terms. And part of his definition was multiculturalism is where the state apparatus, in Australia's case, it's the Commonwealth, which is responsible for ethnic affairs, immigration, multiculturalism, that sort of thing. No longer licenses the founding nation, the nation that created it. He used the word licensing. In other words, permission to be yourself, permission to identify as you wish, permission to defend one's interests, one's group interests. And the Commonwealth, from 1901, from its first piece of legislation in 1901, which was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, that was the White Australia policy, which followed right through to about 1970. That, and before that, the 6 independent colonies had something similar going back to the gold rushes, right? When we were shocked, the colonies were shocked by the influx of Chinese, fine, hardworking people, just not Australians, and the shift in identity was too much. So they decided, no, we must restrict if we're going to remain who we are in this far-flung part of the world. We're not in Europe anymore. We have to think about these things because we're living side by side with large populations who are not Christian, not European racially, and or ethnically or historically. So Australia was one of those settler societies that had to think about these things if it was going to survive in terms of identity survival. So this is the reality of multiculturalism. Professor Brown points out that where the state apparatus transfers its loyalty from the people, from the nation, to minorities. It's as stark as that. So and here's the thing, from my point of view, it's clear that the Commonwealth was created as an instrument of the Anglo-Celtic nation, the historic Australian nation. It's the creation, and openly, explicitly, not some subterfuge, a sort of modern prime minister sort of skulking around doing things under the covers. It was the famous speech, for example, by Sir Henry Parkes, the father of federation. Never lived to see it, but he chaired the first constitutional convention in Melbourne, I think, in 1890, and he gave this famous speech. He said, the crimson thread of kinship runs through us all. And representative after representative of the 6 states said, yes, the crimson thread runs through us all. It was openly declared, proudly declared, we will be an outpost of European civilization, and in particular of Britain, but they saw Britain as in a concentric circle of Western civilization. So we created the Commonwealth to serve our interests. The first piece of legislation was the White Australia policy, which I think is actually a misleading title. It's an assimilationist policy inspired by the great English philosopher John Stuart Mill in the 1860s. So this went back to philosophy, it went back to the primitive social sciences of the time, which turned out to be roughly right too, because Mill put forward a sociological reason for Mill argued immigration of any scale, if it's 1 or 2 people, no, but if it's of any scale, it must be assimilable, because what you want to avoid is diversity. Ethno-religious diversity is poison, in effect, he said. Now, in some ways, he exaggerated it. He said, if you overcome the language problem, basically you've solved the problem. Well, we know that's not true. Modern studies prove his thesis in a broader way, because there are all sorts of ethnic markers, from language, then to accent. Even if you learn the language, most people keep some accent. Their children don't. Their children assimilate that way. Then there's racial markers. And of course, then there's all sorts of cultural markers, from dress to how close one stands to another person when talking, and so on and so forth. Which homeland one remembers that one's great-grandparents came from, and so on. Most of these markers are weak in effect. Some are strong, like language is strong, religion is strong, and so on. So Mill had it right. Sir Henry Parkes, the father of Federation, was a fan of Mill. So he got the idea from Mill, carried it forward, and as late as say the late 1960s, when Prime Minister Bob Menzies gave an interview, and this was brought up, and he was accused of racism, and he said, "Hold on a moment, I think the White Australia policy has served us very well.
Well,
We don't have ethnic conflict."
the Labor opposition leader at the time, Menzies was Prime Minister in the 60s, Arthur Caldwell, also supported the White Australia policy. It was bipartisan up until the mid 1960s, when Holt took over from Menzies and Whitlam took over from Caldwell.
Exactly. And Caldwell is an interesting case in point, because he lost the leadership, I think, in the mid 60s, 65, 67, something like that.
60, after the 66 loss to Holt.
Yeah. Caldwell was Irish Catholic. So this is a really interesting case. He was he was proud of his Irish Catholic origins. He belonged to different Irish Catholic associations. He was an Irish patriot. He believed the British should get the hell out, because that didn't happen, had only happened in 1926, I think. Ireland finally got its independence from Britain. So he was aware of that. He was immensely proud of Australia and identified with Australia, with Anglo-Celtic Australia as well. He saw no conflict there. The conflict between Britain and Ireland was over there. It was over there in Europe, not here in Australia. He knew that Australia was an egalitarian country. He knew that, and so on. So that's an interesting case in point, and I think that he was a visionary. If one reads his book, Be Just and Fear Not, which I think he wrote after he'd left office in 1970, he wrote that. And he's such a visionary. He said, well, if our restrictive immigration policy is relaxed and we become a diverse country, which we have, beyond his worst nightmares, by the way, he said, very soon after that process begins, you have ethnic conflict in the form of, we know what happened, Human Rights Commission, the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act, 1975, brought in by the Whitlam government. You have basically persecution of the majority ethnic group by minorities when they can, and you have bad feeling, and then conflict can multiply. And he was correct. Australia is held up to be the most successful multicultural country in the world.
Oh yes, that's a talking point from liberal politicians and
everybody.
people.
We're the most successful. Let's celebrate our diversity. Well, I think we've done a very good job. I think the Australian people are tolerant, remembering that to tolerate something means to suffer it. So we suffer diversity. Well, I think we're the only other country I've seen is at work. Well, a couple: New Zealand, Canada, and Britain. I worked in London for a year, and I found race relations there extraordinarily relaxed and cooperative compared to the United States, where I've also worked. So I think we have made a good go of multiculturalism in Australia, but the fundamental conflict is unmistakable, which is that the Commonwealth suppresses the expression of white identity. Whites are the ones that are oppressed. And when one does step back and takes the view of political scientist David Brown, one can see why. Well, the Commonwealth has shifted its loyalty from the majority, the founding majority, to various minorities. And if one is going to, and we know sociologically that as diversity increases, ethnic conflict also increases. We know that that's the case. Well, our Australia's historic way of countering that was to only let in people who are readily assimilable and then assimilate them. Let them just naturally assimilate after choosing those who are readily assimilable, namely groups that don't really pose a threat to our identity, our long-term identity anyway. They learn to speak without an accent like you. They identify with place, which is very important. Territory is a very important component of nationhood. And they marry in and so on, and they enculturate the native groups' identity is not challenged, and neither is that of the immigrants so much. Well, that model's gone, and it's been replaced with the multicultural model, which is you open your doors to the world and hope for the best, and diversity just increases. Well, we have ethnic ghettos. Ghettos is too strong a term, but I think you know what I mean. If Melbourne and Sydney
Yes,
have concentrations.
A lot of my audience is based in Melbourne and Sydney, and there's areas which are very heavily Chinese, Vietnamese, Indian. In Melbourne, we have even 2 Greek centres, one in the north in Epping, and then one in the south in Oakley. And so, yeah, there are, particularly in the far north, all the way to the east and the southeast, there are a lot of suburbs which it's one culture which is dominant.
Yeah, and these people, there's nothing wrong with them. This is human nature. This is normal human behavior. Self-segregation to a degree. Some people do it more than others. Of course, there's individual variation, but it's a human universal. The birds of a feather flock together. We feel most comfortable living in suburbs where our identity predominates. That's completely normal. That's not good for a country. It's not good for social cohesion. It's not good to get togetherness and keeping conflict down, but it's what humans do. Again, the founding fathers of Australian Federation were wise. They said, well, let's avoid that. Let's bring in people who readily assimilate again. But, what Hawke was getting at, going back to Hawke's speech, what he was getting at is clearly false, in my view. What he was getting at was, listen, this is a no-brainer. It's bloody obvious that it's wrong for a country to ever protect its identity. No country in the world, I'm generalizing his speech from an attack on Australia to a broad statement of principle, which I think Hawke would have been amenable to that. He was, unlike his predecessor, he was able to think in conceptual terms. No country in the world has a right to discriminate in immigration so as to protect its identity. That's what he was saying. In fact, the ruling state, the state apparatus, should act to open the borders of every country in the world so that anyone can come along. People of any identity. I mean, you might select them on economic grounds and so on. Of course, you wouldn't want too many violent criminals coming in. That's understood. But ethnic identity, racial identity, religious identity, no, that's wrong. And my view is the precise opposite. One of the most grave responsibilities of a government is to protect its nation, meaning its national identity. And people get confused. They think that a nation is a state. No, a nation can try on different state apparatuses, for example, different ways of governing itself. It could be a monarchy, or it could be a republic. It might have one house of parliament, or it might have a bicameral parliament, with a Senate and a lower house. So it could have a large bureaucracy, it could have a small bureaucracy. It could be a welfare state, it could be a laissez-faire, non-welfare state. So it could try all those things. The nation remains. The nation is the ethnic identity. The nation is the ethnic group living in its homeland. That's the core definition. There are other factors, but that's the core definition. A nation is an ethnic group living in its homeland. So the thing about nations are that they create a background level. It's mild compared to family loyalty, compared to perhaps religious loyalty, but it's still there. A nation coheres to something. It's a weak force, but it does cohere, while a diverse population doesn't cohere. It coheres to its parts, to its subgroups. Hence the suburbs you see in Melbourne and Sydney, the concentrations of ethnicities. It seems to me that the Commonwealth needs to be taken back by the nation. Our Commonwealth was stolen from us by the 1960s. I'm not sure how it happened. I'm not sure all the forces at work, but we're facing a crisis of a stolen Commonwealth, which makes us a stateless people. We are a stateless people. And in a world as savage as ours, in a world of mass migration technology, big ships and jumbo jets and all the rest of it, of superpowers such as rising China, and soon after that will come India. And Indonesia is not bad either. It's a massive country compared to Australia. These countries, and the Soviet Union, what is it now? Russia. It's become Russia. In such a competitive world, stateless people are defenseless. They're defenseless. Their interests are not respected. And that's the instinctive reason why every ethnic group wants its own state. It's called nationalism. That's the core of nationalism, not some elaborate theory about this or that, the core is self-government. Nationalism is the wish of an ethnic group to rule itself. And so it wants to control its own state apparatus. That's exactly as our forefathers felt in the 6 colonies. Let's get together. We're so similar. The crimson thread of kinship runs through us all. We're all of British, some more Scottish, some more Irish, some more English, but we're all British. And beyond that, we're closely kindred peoples from Germany or from Scandinavia or from Italy or wherever in Europe. Let's get together and form a continental scale nation, the only country in the world with a whole continent as its homeland. And they didn't create the Commonwealth for the Commonwealth to turn around and say, okay, so you've given birth to me. Now I'm going to basically end you. I'm going to open the borders against your will, against the popular will. I will never allow a vote on it. I'll never allow a public debate on it. And I will make sure that I swamp you over a period of 50, maybe 100 years. Anglo Australia is heading towards minority status in its own country. And this is being done to us by the Commonwealth that has made itself a weapon of various minorities. It's actually basically an instrument of the radical left, which has utopian goals and so on. It's actually an ideological enemy that we face, I think. So I think, and the conservative side of politics, or the nationalist side of politics, has failed to see state what has been happening, which is the Commonwealth was stolen from its rightful owners, those people whose ancestors created it, for them, by them, and it's been stolen and turned against them. So what is the natural thing we need to do? We'll win it back. That's the nationalist goal. The BAC takes a more indirect route. We say that's legitimate if one wants to do it peacefully within the law, that's fine. But what we're doing is playing the multicultural game. Meanwhile, we're demanding the right for Anglo-Celtic Australians to enter the multicultural system in Australia. That's what the British Australian community is all about, where we recognise that we've been massively defeated and we're being rapidly replaced in our own country. That's a tragedy. But instead of whining about it, we're doing what we can in our own small way to play the multicultural game and saying, well, if you're going to force multiculturalism on us, then you can't exclude us. You can't exclude us from that game. We are also an identity group, and we have interests, and we don't want to have our history falsified, and we don't want to be defamed, have our children lied to in our own school system with false history, black armband history. So that's, I think, a valid approach that that the BAC is taking.
Over on Odyssey, Paleoconservative Australian has sent through a $3 tip. So asks, are you still in contact with Kevin MacDonald? Do you agree with him that Jews were responsible for multiculturalism and open borders in Australia? Have you read Brenton Sanderson article on White Australia on Occidental Observer?
Well, most Jews, this is well known. This is just common knowledge in politics. Most Jews are on the left, from the centre left through to more radical left, mostly in the centre left, and most Jews support liberal policies and have played a role. I wouldn't concentrate on that as the major cause of what has happened. So, for example, in our book Anglophobia that I co-authored with Harry Richardson, we go through the various factions that have been promoting open borders in Australia, and the first were after the British Empire, after actually the British Empire was put aside, which actually was a very mixed bag in its attitude towards white Australia. It was Anglo liberals, fairly upper class actually, Anglo liberals who began the immigration reform groups, called sort of groupies, I suppose. And they were supported by important public intellectuals such as Donald Horne, who wrote The Lucky Country. Everyone's heard of that term, The Lucky Country. It was written by him in 1956, I think, in which he attacked white Australia as being pathetic. We need to open our doors to Asia and so on and so forth. So this was happening independently of the Jewish community. Now, we also, and these people were cosmopolitan, so they were doctrinally opposed to nationhood or boundaries or borders. Okay, the same sort of ideas were promoted by the communists, including agents of the Soviet Union. I'm not suggesting for a moment that the groups, immigration reform group, were communists, but just that their policies coincided with other leftists who were arguing that. Funnily enough, it also corresponded with what some minority ethnocentrists believed. So then in the book, we look at some Irish Catholics, pointing out that, as I did earlier just now, that many were loyal to Australia, to the Australian nation, to the British connection and so on. They saw no need to undermine Australia just because there had been a conflict between Britain and Ireland. So we looked at that, and we emphasised the journalism of Greg Sheridan, for example. Greg Sheridan, I think, has changed his mind. I think he's belatedly realised that multiculturalism is a nightmare
I recently, because he's regularly on Sky News, you may want to. I'm not sure if your messenger is open on your computer, but it keeps going off. I'm not sure if you're able to
Don't know
close
how to control it.
but he was repeating the line that Australia is one of the world's most successful multicultural countries, and mentioned that his wife and children are non-white as well, and that's a thing that you mentioned also briefly with the mass immigration that we've had. We are seeing a lot of white Europeans, Anglos, marrying and having children with members of other races, whether they be uh, from Southeast, North Asia, the subcontinent, Middle East, or Africa. And you're right in that the children of these the offspring of these mixed race couples, they do identify like they because they're still, our education system is still primarily taught in English in public schools. Most private schools have a Christian ethos, so they are raised as Australian. They do speak fluent English like you or me, but if a Indian Australian couple have children, they're obviously of Indian pure ethnicity, and so they're going to still have that more attachment to the Indian heritage, which is only a recent addition to Australia. So, can you just explain both going forward, though both types of offspring? How's that going to change or alter the Australian cultural dynamic?
Yeah, it's possible, to discover one's ethnicity. People do it all the time. So there's this phenomenon of first generation, especially in this context, in present context, Islamic immigrants who come in, are law-abiding, work hard, have children, who become terrorists, or to put it, or more likely, become alienated from the larger society and actually spin out of integration with the larger society.
To radical Islam or fundamentalist Islam.
Yeah, so that can happen. So the broad principle I take from that is that ethnic identity can be discovered, and that helps explain why, although people can come in, learn the language, integrate, contribute to the society, have no criminal record, have stable families, the next generation or the next generation can give rise to, and often do give rise to, a degree of separation, of alienation from their children or grandchildren. Now that possibility is counteracted by assimilation. So people often
Are we still
intermarry.
talking about their parents being from the same race, ethno-religious group, the second one that I mentioned?
Well, what I've just said applies especially to that case, because the children are racially Indian, or they're racially, so although they might speak with an ochre accent, they're still aware of their difference subjectively. They think of them, they're aware of their difference, and externally they look different, although speech is very important. Speech is important to help to overcome difference. So if that process continued, it will of course change Australian identity, which whether one accepts it or not, is a fact. It would change the Australian identity. Even worse than that, it would change it unevenly. So, for example, we have more of an Indian migration wave to Melbourne than to Sydney, and more of a Chinese to Sydney than to Melbourne. There's also an east-west divide happening. So our big East Coast cities are attracting most of the Asian immigrants, African as well, immigrants, and they're going to the metropolitan centres. But as soon as you get out of that into country towns close to Melbourne and close to Sydney, it becomes almost like old Australia. You could be back 50 or 80
Some of
years.
those towns are changing, such as in Victoria, Shepparton is deemed a multicultural regional capital.
Oh, it can happen, yeah, of course. But the tendency is for there to be an fairly abrupt east-west divide, so that you have these coastal cities, big cities with a large Asian populations, and then countryside. Maybe there are exceptions, but demographers are noting that. So the demographer, I can't remember his name, who noted this. He works for the Australian newspaper.
Was that Hard Salt?
Exactly, Mr. Salt. And he pointed out this is happening, the Chinese emphasis to Sydney and the Indian emphasis to Melbourne, although there's some mixture, of course, going on. And he said, we've got these big divisions opening up, the concentrations in the east, but not in the center or the west. And he said, so one effect of that is that our easy unity, Australia's been marked by relatively easy unity. You can travel anywhere in Australia and you're among Australians. You realize it's the same country. The climate might be hotter or colder if you go from Darwin down to Tasmania, but they're all Australians. Very slight differences, only slight differences. That's going to go, Mr. Salt explained. That is on the way out, and that's just the cost of the joys of multiculturalism. Well, from my point of view, it's just a cost. There are no compensations. It's just a cost.
Going back to the first demographic changes I mentioned, the mixed race children, where there's one white European parent and one non-white European parent. So I should also ask how, like, I'm not sure if you know any statistics off the top of your head, but how common is that becoming? And are you aware of, because in terms of those children, they because obviously they have mixed white and non-white ancestry, obviously they're going to look different, but they do have that in one parent, that white European ancestry history there.
Yeah, that's a fact. I'm not aware of the figures. I'm not aware of the figures. One thing that is extraordinary, I've just been corresponding with a demographer colleague, and I was asking what is the birth rate of Anglo-Celtic Australians? There's no established data on that, as far as I'm told by the demographer. No known figures on that. Intermarriage rates, I suspect there are studies that have been done, but no, I'm not aware of the figures. But if the immigration had been moderate, this could all be solved by assimilation. Because if you take that mixed couple with mixed background children resulting, so those children are half Asian. Say we're talking about one of the Asian countries, or an African country. So the children are half white. If they then marry also into the white majority, because in this futurology, imaginary case, I'm assuming that whites remain the overwhelming majority of the country. So then imagine they marry. Well, then their children are a quarter white, are a quarter non-white, and becoming indistinguishable. Not quite, maybe, not quite. Depends on the genetic distance between the different groups. But then one more generation, 1/8, basically unrecognizable. Problem solving itself. What is the problem? Conflict, alienation, and conflict. Most of the conflict is political. I don't mean civil war. I mean political conflict, where you have people feeling bitter about ethnic stratification. That's one terrible cost that diverse countries almost all pay, which is, stratification by ethnic group, which is just absolutely unacceptable. It's a terrible price to pay for the scant benefits of diversity. People feel resentful when their group, they perceive their group as being not as high status as others, and especially if this continues for some generations, which can happen when you have low rates of assimilation. Low rates of intermarriage can result in, for example, the black population in America has low rates of intermarriage. I think it's 3% of marriages per year between black and white. So the two groups are very stable. So it's a multi-generational problem. And the black resentment is tremendous. And the feeling that they've been badly done by, and so on. And of course, the commensurate white guilt, because this situation is complicated by race hustlers who are telling both parties, well, you should be guilty and you should be angry.
This is another aspect that it's been a thing for many centuries. White man's burden. It's our responsibility to take care of these downtrodden different groups and cultures, and help them up to do better. And that's one of the reasons why some believe that that whites are responsible for their own downfall. Another argument that's made that whites are responsible for the downfall of their own societies is because it's an individualistic culture, where most of the other cultures on the world in the world are collectivists. I mean, and the mass migration, various ethnic culture, racial groups that come here, they still practice their collectivism in their community within their own suburb.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. There's a lot. It's the blame game, isn't it? There's a lot of blaming going on, and some are accusing whites of having too much agency and using that agency for bad purposes. By the way, that view is a racist view itself. One thing that shifted is 100 years ago, to be European was to be part of an still expanding civilization. 110 years ago, the First World War had not been fought, which crippled, did tremendous damage. There was tremendous self-confidence. People around the world realized that this was a phenomenon of a 400-year-long expansion of this relatively small peninsula called Europe. The Industrial Revolution invented there, globalism invented by the British Empire, global trading networks developed by these various empires, European empires, a tremendous self-confidence in their Christianity. It's a world-changing phenomenon, the Western expansion from the Renaissance, on. and it began internally, artistically and commercially and intellectually, but then it became a world-changing event. We are now much further down the track. We're now at the tail end. I hope not, but I fear we're at the tail end of the ending of the West. That some of the things that made us really strong, like individualism, individual freedom of expression, which had to be fought for in our own countries too, in Britain and Europe, constitutional rule, all these imponderables, non-material benefits that we had, has been a phenomenon. But that's well behind us now. Now we have a loss of confidence. We have a separation of our elites from our various nations. Most Western nations do not have elites that are loyal to the founding nation. So that's an extraordinary thing. And we need to be teaching our young people about our glorious past, tremendous challenges, terrible things, terrible wars, but also amazing achievements that our ancestors made, and that we're worth continuing, that their people are worth continuing and not being ended in their own countries.
Of course, today in Australia, young white people are taught the black armband view of Australian history, a coin termed by historian Geoffrey Blaney in the 1980s, and his books on Australian history are glorious, and we see it reflected in all the left-wing parties. That it always comes around every Australia Day. They declare that it's in Invasion Day. The Labor governments, they enable this undermining. And I know that British Australian community on its YouTube channel put out a vision of genuine reconciliation. We talked about race mixing before. The 3% of Australians who identify as having Indigenous Australian ancestry, that has been going on since British settlement began. Though we are seeing that a lot of those who have mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous ancestry, they are some of the most vocal anti-whites, anti-Australian. Now, yeah, the videos that British Australian community put out a vision of genuine reconciliation. In my opinion, reconciliation, it's designed never to happen, just so the people who benefit from all the money and the gravy train and this continuing division can continue to get all of these all of this money and these elite positions, and is actually seeing the fracturing of Australia, with another historian, Keith Winchell, calls the Great Australian Giveaway, which Paul Keating started with native title. So I'd say we're as far away from genuine reconciliation, if that even is a term, as possible.
Yeah, I think that it's remarkable, isn't it, that the referendum last year was defeated, despite huge resources, an imbalance of resources in favour of the Yes campaign. So I was very happy to see the referendum defeated, and it was conducted in the name of reconciliation. That is really a lie, and is really a lie. Reconciliation is where two parties that have been in conflict, legal conflict, commercial conflict, emotional, family conflict, get together and talk and make compromises. They admit where they've made errors. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's not one party saying, submit. That's not called reconciliation. That's called victory.
That's what the voice. That's what the voice was, and what all of these First Peoples Assembly, with regards to treaty, it's all a one-sided negotiation.
Yeah.
All of these First Peoples Assembly, we're demanding it all on our terms, not on white terms, which they're supposed to be the other party. There's no one representing there.
Exactly.
There's no Anglo Australian assemblies to negotiate on Anglo Australians' behalf.
Anglo-Celtic Australians were systematically and 100% excluded from the referendum process. It's an outrage, and I take that back, by the way, that analysis back to 2013, when the Labor Party in office initiated the first attempt to have a referendum. And that was for constitutional recognition. And if one looks at the expert panel put together by the government, there's not one Anglo-Celtic representative. There are minorities represented. There are, of course, different Aboriginal peoples represented, as they should have been, of course. There were several white people, all activists, not just or advocates for Aboriginal rights, from the Aboriginal point of view, but not one person saying, well, hold on, I'm here to represent the interests of the nation, and at the core of which is Anglo-Celtic Australia. Not one. So as a result of that, and no one even noticed, no one even cared, and this includes Liberal prime ministers. This includes the National Party. No one said, oh, what about us, by the way? This is meant to be about reconciliation, isn't it? About, it's meant to be a reciprocal thing, isn't it? Then we also have some complaints. So notice, in the newspapers and commentary and so on, no one's been talking about Aborigines apologising to white Australia, to other citizens. No one's been saying, well, why don't we have Aboriginal leaders saying sorry for the things that their people have done wrong? I don't mean in general. I mean for specific wrongs, like huge crime levels, like incredibly disgusting levels of family violence, which gives Australia a bad name, which around the world, but which are bad in their own right, of course. About the huge costs. We're pouring money into this. And what thanks do we get? Oh, we want our own state. We want treaties. We want. Well, we also want. We also exist, and we are mainly the taxpayers who are paying for all this. And we have to live in country towns where we have to be careful. We can't go there. We can't go here. There's pilfering. There's huge drug use and petty theft. What about starting with an apology from Aboriginal leaders where appropriate, not everywhere necessarily, but where these problems are at epidemic proportions? How about starting off with a good conscience cleansing, sorry, we're really sorry, we can't control our kids. Sorry about that. If our Prime Minister, Rudd, can say sorry, can apologise on behalf of Australians, the overwhelming majority of whom have done nothing wrong to Aborigines, right? If that can happen, then why not in the other direction? That would be a cleansing moment. That would be a moral moment. That would be the basis of a conversation. Okay, let's sit down and talk about what we can do for each other. So what do you want? Oh, you want special medical assistance. And there are special medical needs for evolutionary reasons, by the way, for obvious evolutionary reasons, like refined carbohydrates are killing Aborigines. alcohol is killing Aborigines. None of this would come to a surprise to any leader, Aboriginal leader who knows about this. But the reasons are evolutionary. But that doesn't mean that those problems go away. It just means that this will be a long-term commitment by the nation, and I think most Australians are willing to do that. What else do you need? Well, okay, problems because you want to live in your country. We understand that there's a strong bond, especially among traditional Aborigines, with their homelands, of which there are 500 in Australia. Originally, there were 500. There was no Aboriginal nation. There were hunter-gatherer groups living in intimate relationship with their environments, surviving, doing a fantastic job surviving, really impressive. So, okay, so you can't get a job because of that. We'll help. We understand. We're sympathetic. And then what else? What else? Oh, you would like your languages preserved. Okay, we're sympathetic to that. And on. You know, sometimes more sympathetic than others, I'm sure. You want political independence and a treaty? No. You want to be able to have your own state? No. Sorry. Actually, we're not very sorry. Just no. And then at the end of it, we would say, okay, now it's our turn. Now sit down. Here's what we want. We want the family violence to end. We want the glue sniffing to end. We want the rampant abuse and neglect of children. 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds running around the towns at midnight with their parents, oblivious in the house, partly because they're and also avoiding violence from the father. We want that to end, and we're willing to pay for it. We're willing to do what we can, but we want your cooperation, beginning with an admission. Yes, it is a problem. We have our problems also to solve. So that will be genuine reconciliation. And we're hearing nothing of it. The closest we hear comes from Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, for example, two Aboriginal spokesmen that I really respect. I'm not saying that is their view, but they're at least getting in that direction of honesty and openness. Jacinta Price calls herself, I think, an Aboriginal Celtic person. So she refers to both sides of her ancestors.
And so does, I've had him on my show, Dr. Anthony Dillon, who is also another prominent advocate with Indigenous ancestry.
Yeah. And I think we need some truth-telling. That's another thing we hear again and again from the Uluru Statement. Truth-telling. Makarata. Okay? All for it. Let's have the truth on both sides. The things our ancestors, because it's not us who did wrong, it's our ancestors. The things our ancestors did wrong and your ancestors did wrong.
Because the history is, it's taught that it's the cartoonish good and evil, that the British came here and just massacred the Indigenous tribes in various frontier wars. That's the black and white history, pardon the pun, that's taught, where it's much more complex nuance. There were periods of peace and trade, and then there were disputes, and the aggression wasn't started exclusively on one side or the other.
Yes, correct. And also the part of this simplistic black armband history, excuse the pun, is that 26th of January is Invasion Day. We should feel bad. We, white Australians, should feel bad about this because we took away their country and so on. When I look at that, when I review the history leading up to 1788, the first fleet. And I review the history. Again, I can't help coming to the conclusion that Aborigines did about as well as could be expected. In fact, they did far better than could have happened. Look, by the mid 18th century, say by 1750, the world was a shark tank. 2 or 3 days after the first fleet arrived on 26 January, a French fleet arrived, sniffing around. Oh, we're on a scientific expedition. La Perouse was the captain of that, the commander of that. And we have a beach in Sydney named after La Perouse. He then went missing. We had already centuries of colonization behind us. I mean Europe, the Portuguese, Spanish. They discovered the Americas. Then we had extraordinary Little Holland. Little Holland became a world exploration giant. Parts of Australia were discovered by the Dutch. Tasmania was first mapped by a Dutch explorer, Van Diemen, hence it was called Van Diemen's Land, and so on and so forth. The world was already a shark tank. All these patrolling, exploring, acquisitive, assertive empires, all these countries building their empire. The Russians were building the largest land empire in the world right across Eurasia, right across the north of Eurasia. And they had a navy. They had a navy soon after that. So there was a clash between the expanding Russian Empire and the expanding British Empire. And that's why Fort Denison was constructed in the middle of Sydney Harbour with cannon aimed at the heads. It was against the perceived risk of a Russian invasion of Australia. So then I run a mental experiment. Okay, so imagine if Australia had not been colonized by the British from 1788. How would Aborigines have resisted any of these forces? They couldn't have resisted any of them. They would have been open pickings. And why not Java? Java was a seagoing country. It had a trade network with India, hence Indonesia. There's a historical connection. Around 1600, I might be wrong, might be 1500, a major fleet left China and explored parts of East Africa and so on. So China was certainly capable of having ocean-going junks. And we're told, oh, you shouldn't have invaded us. You shouldn't have come because we could have had our own country. It takes millennia after the introduction of agriculture for a country to grow. It has to grow 100-fold in population, right? So when a culture goes from hunter-gatherer means of existence to farming or to herding, it takes the population increases 100-fold. That can take certainly many centuries, if not millennia. Then there's cultural evolution, political systems, the unification. There's no way that Australia would have been ever in a position to defend itself from these marauding sharks setting up their empires around the world. They struck it lucky when they were annexed, when they were colonized by Great Britain. They struck it lucky. The country with the most advanced liberal politics. I'm not saying it was liberal. I'm just saying that strand of its politics was the most advanced. It had just begun the Industrial Revolution from about 1750. So it was about 30, 40 years into the Industrial Revolution, which meant a cornucopia of wealth, unknown until then. So and also Australia and its inhabitants were brought into contact with the only form of global trade, which was via European empires, especially the British Empire. So globalism, in the sense of trade, of global trade, was invented by the British Empire. They were brought into that, and brought in democratically. They were voting in most states of Australia by the mid 19th century. And we're told, oh no, you Australians should feel guilty about this. We should feel pride, immense pride, that we colonised a continent on the other side of the world. Never been done before. I don't think it had ever been done before. Something as extraordinary as that. What an achievement. All in all, Aboriginal Australians hit the jackpot. Of course, there was suffering. I'm not saying it was a utopia, but it was the best outcome that I can imagine.
Unfortunately, we don't get this history in schools anymore. Even 30 years ago, I was taught the achievements of British settlement, but also the Indigenous Dreamtime culture as well. We were basically taught both and obviously it was taught that Australia was settled and founded by the British Anglo Celtic people. It's been great to chat with you tonight, Frank. We've chatted off and off over the years, but it's been great to have a chat on air with you. And the British Australian community is its social presence is really hitting the mark. So the professional videos that you've got, there includes a two-part on Anglophobia. Well, it's actually 4-part, but goes through the various
and more are coming too.
And so the videos are there. If you want to get your hands on the full text, so the website is anglophobia.org, which redirects to British Australian Community.com.au Anglophobia, and you can get it from Amazon. If I click on this link, Amazon Australia is the easiest place to get it, and your Magnus Opus on evolutionary human biology on genetic interests, also available on Amazon, though that is much more heavy reading.
Yeah, sorry about that.
But if you really want to get to know where Frank's coming from, because is studied and practiced this his whole life, and so British Australian Community.com.au, and so you're a proper organization with a constitution and membership.
Exactly. And membership is cheap at $25. Its membership is automatic, and we'd love to have you on board. We need people with skills, such as yours, Tim. We need people with computer skills, internet skills.
Well, I said to you at the beginning, I'm German Australian. So is there, do you have to be an Anglo Australian to join? When I asked that, is it even legal to have that membership requirement?
Well, we would never break the law. Of course, the law is very important. No, membership is open, and but we're just talking about the spirit in which we would welcome you. Of course, people from ancestors from Europe We consider kindred peoples, and there's one closing point on that. We were discussing. You asked me about the situation of people, hybrids, people of partly white, partly non-white background. An important factor there is foreground identity versus background identity. So in the current climate where whites are being set upon by the media and by the education systems and by Hollywood and so on, some people want to identify as Aboriginal or as Asian or as African, and ignoring their Anglo grandparents. I think what's going to happen in the future is people are going to begin rediscovering their Anglo ancestors. And when they do that, they'll start to think of themselves more consciously, more times every day, as an Anglo-Celt or as a white Australian. And so their loyalties will shift.
I'm not sure if you've met Josh Howe. So he's half Anglo-Australian and half Sri Lankan, but he's part of the Australia First Groiper movement in Australia. Obviously, him being a Christian makes him identify more with his Anglo side as well. But just thought that I'd throw in a real life example of.
Well, that is an example. So there we have Josh. Josh could think of himself as Sri Lankan, or he could think of himself as white, or both. Hopefully both. Hopefully he's realistic. But when Jacinta Price calls herself an Aboriginal Celtic woman, I mean, that is just real, and it shows that she's not pretending that she's only Aboriginal descent. Now, the cosmopolitan left, their view on this is too often, I think, plays the guilt game, and they think they expect people of mixed ancestry to identify with the victimhood side, with the victim side of their ancestors, and to somehow ignore the conqueror, the perpetrator side.
They believe that white Europeans have no real culture. That's the other thing.
Yeah. They play many tricks, but one of them is to pretend that somehow, if a half of one's ancestry are victims, one should focus on that. Why? Why not celebrate also the winners? Why only the losers, if one has to look at it that way?
Oh, well, that's also follow the money as well, whereas there's more money these days in being a victim.
Exactly. Very, very well said.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Frank Salter, for your time tonight. It's been great to chat with you, and you've had also other recent Australian media appearances over on the Backbench Drivers podcast. There's two of them now, and so, like I said, the British Australian community, the word is spreading. So thank you for your time.
Tim, thank you very much for a fine interview.
Take care.
All the best.
All right, everybody. That is WilmsFront for this program, but I will be back on Tuesday evening. So there won't be a theorist show. There will be another WilmsFront at 9 p.m. Melbourne time on the WilmsFront channels. With another guest, David Clues from the Unity News Network over in Glasgow in the UK. So Unity News Network is an actual free speech nationalist news network, not like the fake ones, GB News and Talk TV and Spiked and Unheard and Trigonometry. So I'll be looking forward to some frank discussions about the state of Britain in election year. Tim's News Explosion will be on tomorrow night as usual, 9 p.m. Melbourne time on the WilmsFront channels. There'll be more reports from Richard Wollstonecroft. I'll be recording fresh ones later this week. Remember, the Unshackled Productions archive now is over on Substack. So I'll put the link into it there, and you can also support the work of the Unshackled through a Substack subscription, $5 per month, $50 per month. And we still have our Unshackled membership options, which is $5 per month, silver $10 per month, gold $25 per month, and platinum $50 per month. And also I should thank Paleoconservative Australian for tonight's tip over on Odyssey, where your name is still open borders for Israel. You've had various names over the years, but I know I know which worked out which ones are you on the various platforms. So yes, I've quoted Unity News Network on a couple of shows now. So yes, David Clues is weekly live streams, which are on Tuesday evenings UK time. So he'll be joining me UK morning time. So I'm looking, as I said, looking forward to an actual discussion, not a prosciutto prosciutto discussion like you see on Talk TV with Douglas Murray or Constantine Kissin, you know, all those people who believe that anyone to the right of anyone from Tommy Robinson right onwards is far right. Paleoconservative Australian says, are you burying your website, Tim? Still publishing on the website. Over on the unshackled.net, I still post the reality talk radio segments. So I'm on every Tuesday morning with Paul Brennan's breakfast program, and Dewey DeBoer. He is just his show, the dialogue. That is being well received, and he had Austrian identitarian Martin Sellner on his show on Friday, which was an excellent guest get, and it triggered the usual anti-hate groups in New Zealand writing about reality check radio and him, which it's always good when your enemies give you a shout out. So it'll be on Tuesday at 9 p.m. Melbourne time. I'll be chatting with David Clues. So there'll be no theorists this week. An extra WilmsFront in place of that. Yes, Constantine is coming to Australia, guest of the Institute of Public Affairs, which I feel vindicated by not renewing my membership back in 2017. If they're going to invite somebody like him, he criticized that conservative MP who said the truth about London and Sadiq Khan. His name's just escaped me. Just escaped me currently. Put it in the comments. Comments if you remember that conservative MP has been suspended for telling the truth about Sadiq Khan. I'll talk a bit of British news tomorrow night on Tim's News Explosion, but it'll primarily be about tomorrow on Tuesday, British politics. So Brucey says, shout out to Endeavour News for Kiwi Nationalist podcast on YouTube. I haven't checked them out, but I definitely will. So good night. I'll see you all back 9 p.m. tomorrow night for another epic Tim's News Explosion. Remember to follow mine and the Unshackled social media on Telegram, Gab, Twitter, X, and also Facebook. And of course, we have the backups on Rumble and Odyssey in case things end on YouTube. Good night, everybody, and thank you for your viewership and support.
Broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront. Brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.